On the afternoon of February 14, 2018, Parkland felt quiet, just like any other day. The dismissal bell rang. Students stepped into the hallways, backpacks on their shoulders, laughing about ordinary plans. Valentine's messages were being sent. Classroom doors closed after another routine school day. No one knew that in just a few minutes, those familiar sounds would be replaced by gunfire. Familiar hallways would become places of life and death, and 17 lives, children, teachers, human beings carrying the most ordinary dreams, would never make it home. The most haunting question is not what happened, it is why it was able to happen. The shooting in Parkland was not just a crime. It was the moment when the entire United States was forced to look directly at itself. At children forgotten in silence. At warning signs that had appeared before, but no one had been patient enough to truly listen. And this story begins on a day that should have been about nothing but love. Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School was not a place unfamiliar with hardship, yet it was, at its heart, just an ordinary American high school. Long corridors, sunlit classrooms, walls covered with posters celebrating sports teams and youthful dreams. Every day, thousands of students passed through its gates with a simple belief that this was a place that would shield them from the uncertainty of the outside world. That afternoon, classes continued as usual. Teachers delivered their lessons. Students took notes, occasionally glancing at the clock, hoping the final bell would ring a little sooner. Some were thinking about football practice. Others were excited about a first date on Valentine's Day. No one realized that these were the final moments of calm. In American culture, school is more than a place of learning. It is a community, a second family, a place where teachers become protectors and guides, a place where students believe that, no matter what happens, they are safe behind the classroom door. Because of that, when danger appeared, no one was mentally prepared to face it. No student imagined they would have to run for their life inside the very school they knew so well. No teacher believed that, within just a few minutes, they would be forced to make life and death decisions. The moment of reckoning was drawing very close. But at Marjory Stoneman Douglas, no one knew it. Calm still lingered in the air, and sometimes, it is that very calm that leaves people most vulnerable when disaster strikes. Before becoming a name that shook the entire United States, Nicolas Cruz was just a lost teenager. Not someone who stood out in a crowd. Not someone who was liked, almost invisible in places that were supposed to offer a sense of belonging. People who lived around Cruz remembered him as a troubled child, quiet, quick to anger, with eyes that carried an unease difficult to put into words. There were outbursts with no clear reason, behaviors that pushed others away, moments when even adults did not know how to respond. Neighbors said Cruz had shown cruelty toward animals, acts that went beyond childish mischief and carried a cold, unsettling violence. In psychology, this is often considered an early warning sign, but at the time, it was seen as little more than odd behavior and quickly dismissed. At school, Cruz did not fit in. Disciplinary problems grew more frequent. He was expelled. He was banned from carrying a backpack on campus. He was labeled a problem student. Yet behind those disciplinary measures, there was almost no real healing taking place. In American culture, there is constant talk of personal freedom, of the right to be oneself. But for unstable children, freedom without support can become isolation. Cruz grew up feeling excluded, misunderstood, slowly consumed by his own anger. 1 year before the tragedy, a chilling comment appeared on social media. "I am going to become a professional school shooter." The words drifted past among millions of others. No one identified the writer. No one stopped long enough to ask, what if this is not a joke? The warning signs were there. The pieces of the puzzle had appeared. But they existed in isolation, unconnected, unheard. And when a troubled child is not helped in time, that quiet anger can grow, turning into something no one is able to control. The tragedy in Parkland did not begin with gunfire. It began long before that. In silence. On the afternoon of February 14, 2018, Nicolas Cruz left his place of residence like he had many times before. There were no signs of panic, no sense of urgency. Everything unfolded with a calm that was almost terrifying. Cruz called an Uber, sat silently in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the window, where the Florida sunlight still shone brightly, as if nothing out of the ordinary was about to happen. The car stopped at the entrance of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Cruz stepped out, a backpack slung over his shoulder, looking completely ordinary. But inside that backpack was a different world. An AR-style rifle, magazines already loaded, and a decision from which there was no turning back. Cruz walked toward the school campus, his posture straight, his steps steady, no hesitation. A school staff member saw him. He recognized him immediately. A former student who had caused repeated trouble, a familiar face tied to memories of problems that had never truly been resolved. In that moment, instinct told him something was wrong. Cruz was moving toward the building with a cold, focused intensity. The staff member immediately radioed his colleagues. A brief warning. The right reaction. But time, at that point, had already become cruel. In American school culture, the school gate represents the boundary of safety. A place where students are protected. A place where adults believe that terrible things cannot easily cross. But on that day, that boundary was breached. Less than 1 minute after Cruz was spotted, the first sounds rang out. No one had time to understand what was happening. No one had time to react in the way they had practiced during safety drills. The moment Cruz entered the school was not just a step through physical space. It was the moment when an unstable past, a chain of ignored warning signs, and years of silence finally collided head-on with the present. And from that instant on, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was no longer just an ordinary school. It became the center of a tragedy that no one was able to stop in time. The gunshots rang out with almost no warning. A sharp, jarring sound, out of place in an afternoon that had seemed peaceful. In that first instant, many people did not believe what they were hearing. Some students thought it was fireworks. Some teachers assumed it was an incident happening somewhere outside. The human mind instinctively tries to deny the worst, especially when it happens in a place that is supposed to be safe. But only seconds later, the truth crashed in. Another gunshot. Clearer, closer, and carrying fear that spread like a rising wave. The once familiar hallways suddenly felt foreign. Rushing footsteps, voices shouting names, classroom doors slamming shut in panic. Some students hid under desks. Others pressed their backs against the walls, their hearts pounding so loudly they could barely hear anything else. In those first moments, there were no heroes, no perfect script. There were only people. Children who had not yet had the chance to grow up. Teachers forced to make split-second decisions, torn between protecting themselves and protecting their students. Some tried to call their parents, calls cut short, messages left unsent, words of love trapped between trembling fingers. Outside, life went on. Cars continued to pass. The sky remained blue. But inside that school, time felt crushed and suffocating. Every second that passed felt heavier than the one before. That first minute of gunfire did not just mark the beginning of an attack. It marked the moment when the childhoods of many were stolen forever. The moment when trust in safety collapsed, leaving a deep fracture in the collective memory of an entire community. And when the sound rang out again, there was no doubt left. The tragedy had begun. After the first gunshots, fear spread across the campus like a storm with no visible shape. Students began to run. Not in any clear direction. Driven only by the instinct to move away from the deadly sound drawing closer. Some fell and scrambled back to their feet. Others stood frozen, too overwhelmed to even understand what was happening. Nicolas Cruz moved through different areas of the school with a chilling calm. He fired at anyone who appeared in his path, without selection, without hesitation. Long hallways that once served as gathering places for students now became corridors of desperate escape. Gunfire echoed off the walls, reverberating through the buildings, making it impossible to tell where the danger was coming from. Inside classrooms, teachers struggled to stay calm, even as their own hands trembled. Some whispered instructions for students to get down, turn off the lights, and remain silent. Others stood in front of classroom doors, using their own bodies to shield the children behind them. In those moments, no one thought about titles or professional duty. There was only one thought: keep the students alive. Some students ran into the outdoor areas, places that should have offered a sense of escape. But panic turned everything into chaos. Some turned back, unsure where the exits were. Others hid behind planters and bushes, holding their breath and listening for every sound. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, even though, in reality, it was all unfolding within just a few short minutes. Elsewhere in the school, the wounded lay on the floors, surrounded by scattered backpacks and unfinished notebook pages. Some called out the names of their friends. Others fought to stay conscious, telling themselves they had to survive. There were eyes staring up at the ceiling, filled with confusion, fear, and an unspoken question. Why was this happening here? In American culture, schools are seen as places of refuge, spaces where children are protected from the violence of the outside world. Because of that, when violence enters these spaces, the shock is not only personal, it shatters a shared belief, cutting deep into the collective mind of an entire community. Those terrifying minutes are not measured only by the number of bullets or the number of victims. They are measured by split-second decisions, instinctive actions, and moments when people are forced to confront their deepest fear. When the gunfire finally subsided, the campus was no longer a place of youth and dreams. It became a haunted space, where painful memories would linger long into the future. As the gunfire began to thin out, something no one expected happened. Nicholas Cruz stopped. There were no more shots, no more shouting. He removed the weapon, discarded his body armor, and left magazines behind along his path. Objects that had carried death now lay silently across the campus, as if they had never belonged to a human being at all. Cruz began to walk slowly. He blended into the flow of students frantically trying to escape. Like them, he lowered his head and moved with the crowd, his face empty of emotion. In that moment, the line between perpetrator and victim blurred in a way that was deeply unsettling. The students around him had no idea that the person walking beside them was the one who had just opened fire. They saw only a quiet teenager, appearing as stunned as everyone else. That detail is what later kept many people awake at night. Evil does not always look frightening. Sometimes, it looks completely ordinary. After leaving the school grounds, Cruz kept moving. He entered a nearby store, sat down, and ordered food, as if trying to cling to one last fragment of normal life. But the police perimeter was closing in. Clues were quickly pieced together. An identification was made. When police approached and arrested Cruz, there was no resistance. No immediate justification. Just a 19-year-old man in handcuffs, led away in silence. A flesh and blood human being standing at the center of a tragedy that had just taken 17 lives. That moment of arrest did not bring relief. It did not erase the pain. It did not turn time backward. For many, it was only a heavy period, closing the act of violence while opening an even more painful chain of questions. How could one person blend in among the very victims of his own actions? And how had society allowed things to go this far? Amid the chaos and fear, when the instinct to survive pushes people to run for their lives, there were still those who did the opposite. They did not flee. They stayed, not because they were unafraid, but because other lives mattered more than their own fear. Coach Aaron Feiss was one of them. He had once been a student at this very school. He had walked those same hallways, carrying the ordinary dreams of youth. When the gunshots rang out, he could have left, but he chose to stay. He chose to face danger, to shield the terrified students behind him. Then there was teacher Scott Bagel. In a decisive moment, he opened his classroom door and let students run inside for shelter. Those few seconds saved many lives. But he did not have time to lock the door. When the gunfire sounded again, he fell at the very threshold he had just opened to protect his students. One student later recalled, their voice trembling, "I thought he was standing right behind me. But when I turned around, he was lying on the floor. In that moment, many children learned what sacrifice meant, in the most painful way possible. In American culture, people often talk about heroes, but in Parkland, the heroes did not wear capes. They were teachers, coaches, people who went to work every day with a simple purpose: to guide and protect the next generation. And on that fateful day, they used their own lives to keep that unspoken promise. Those who did not run did more than save others. They left behind a lesson that is both heartbreaking and profound: that even in the deepest darkness of violence, courage and humanity can still shine, even when the price is something that can never be repaid. When the gunfire fell silent, what remained was not only panic. What remained were voids that could never be filled. 17 people fell that afternoon, 17 lives, each carrying a story that would never be fully told. Some were only 14 years old, still learning how to understand themselves, still holding dreams that were small and pure. A summer ahead, a game coming up, a promise to their parents that would never be kept. Everything ended in a school hallway, a place that should have held nothing but footsteps and laughter. There were teachers and coaches who walked into that school every day with quiet responsibility. They did not think about being heroes or making sacrifices. They thought only about protecting their students, and in the moment that mattered most, they did exactly that, with everything they had. After the tragedy, bedrooms remained just as they were, backpacks unopened, family photos turned into final memories. Parents stood at their children's doors, unable to comprehend how to accept that silence. No words were enough to comfort them. No amount of time was enough to heal them. In American culture, there is a belief that every child has an open future, that education is a path toward hope. But in Parkland, that hope was cut short with brutal finality. Lives left unfinished became a painful reminder that violence does not only take lives, it takes away everything that might have been. The 17 victims are not just a number. They were someone's children, someone's friends, part of a community that will never be whole again. And their memory, no matter how painful, must continue to be spoken, so that no one is forgotten, and so that this pain is not left without meaning. Outside the school gates, as the wail of ambulance sirens filled the air, parents began to gather. They stood close together, yet each was alone inside their own fear. Phones clutched in their hands, eyes fixed on the screens, waiting for a single message, a single call, any sign that their child was still alive. Some calls were answered. Some cries broke out in relief. But there were also phones that remained brutally silent. That silence stretched on, gnawing away at every second, every minute, until hope no longer had the strength to hold on. As the list of victims was slowly confirmed, fear gave way to loss. A father realized he would never again hear his child call home from school. A mother stood frozen before the reality that the familiar bedroom at home would remain empty forever. Hugs were no longer tight enough. Words of comfort no longer carried meaning. In the days that followed, families struggled to survive in a new reality. A reality where dinner was missing one chair, where small routines became blades cutting deep into memory. Some parents could not bring themselves to enter their child's room. Others left everything exactly as it was, as if waiting just a little longer might bring their child back. In American culture, family is seen as the final refuge against life's upheavals. But in Parkland, family itself became the place that held an unspeakable pain. A pain that was not loud. It was quiet, enduring, and carried with them for the rest of their lives. The tragedy did not end when the gunfire stopped. It continued to live in the hearts of those left behind. In every morning they woke up. In every moment they remembered a future that had been stolen away, and that is the heaviest cost of all, one that no verdict and no sentence can ever truly ease. Nicolas Cruz did not emerge into society as a monster already shaped by violence. Before becoming the center of a national tragedy, he was a young person who grew up amid prolonged fractures, where the feeling of being abandoned slowly became a constant state of being. Those who had contact with Cruz described an unpredictable personality. Quick to anger, struggling to control his emotions, frequently expressing hostility and withdrawal. In social relationships, Cruz never found a place to belong. At school, he did not fit in. In the community, he was seen as different. And that difference, instead of being met with support and guidance, was pushed further away through labels and punishment. Psychology suggests that when an individual repeatedly feels they belong nowhere, anger can become the only way to assert their existence. For Cruz, that anger accumulated year after year. It was fed by rejection, neglect, and a lack of understanding. No one truly stopped long enough to ask what he needed, or what he was afraid of. In American culture, personal strength and the ability to stand up alone in the face of adversity are often celebrated. But not everyone has the psychological foundation to do that on their own. For troubled young people, the absence of deep, consistent support can turn pain into hatred, and hatred into actions that cannot be undone. Examining Cruz's psychological profile is not an attempt to justify the crime. No circumstance can excuse the taking of another person's life, but confronting the human being behind the act is necessary, if society does not want to repeat the same tragedy. Nicolas Cruz stands as a painful reminder of what can happen when a troubled child grows up in silence. When cries for help are dismissed as inconveniences, and when anger is left unhealed, it will eventually find its way out in the most devastating form possible. Before the tragedy happened, there were warnings. Not loud, not unmistakable, but enough to make anyone pause, if they were willing to listen. 1 year before the shooting, a comment appeared on social media, speaking about becoming a school shooter. The words drifted past among countless other lines of text, then disappeared into the indifference of the online world. Federal investigators received the information. They reviewed data. They searched for traces. But they could not identify a specific individual. And there were no concrete details about time or location. The file was gradually closed. Life went on. And so did the danger. At school, Nicolas Cruz was not an unknown name. He had been expelled for disciplinary issues. He had been identified as a high-risk student, but amid administrative actions and rule enforcement, there was no support system deep enough to intervene in the psychological crisis growing inside him. In the culture of large institutions, unclear warnings are often placed low on the list of priorities. When there is no concrete evidence, people choose to wait. But with violence, waiting can sometimes be a fatal mistake. After Parkland, authorities acknowledged the need to reconsider how information is handled. But that reflection came too late for the 17 people who were lost. The warnings that went unheard became a bitter reminder that in a world filled with noisy signals, missing just one call for attention can lead to consequences beyond repair. When the gunfire receded into the past, the law stepped forward with a task that was cold, yet necessary. Nicolas Cruz appeared in court in silence. There were no longer chaotic crowds, no longer the sounds of panic, only a solemn courtroom where every detail was revisited through the dry, precise language of the legal system. 17 counts of murder were read aloud. Each count was a name, a life, a family left behind. For the victims' relatives, every hearing forced them to relive that fateful day. They sat there, facing the person who had taken their children's futures, while their pain remained as raw as it had been from the very beginning. Cruz was held without bail. The legal process moved forward according to the rules. Justice was pursued through statutes and evidence. But justice, no matter how severe, could not restore the family dinners that had lost their laughter. It could not fill the empty seats at graduations that were meant to happen. In American culture, the courtroom is where society seeks balance after chaos. It is where the principle is affirmed that violence will not be tolerated. But in Parkland, even the harshest sentence could not bring complete relief. It closed one chapter of the crime while opening a long journey of healing. One that many families know they will have to walk for the rest of their lives. After Parkland, America no longer woke up the same way. That tragedy did not remain confined to the grounds of a single school. It spread across states, seeped into morning news broadcasts, into family conversations, into classrooms where students looked at one another with a fear they had never known before. In many places, schools began receiving copycat threats. Alarm bells rang. Students were evacuated. Parents rushed to school gates, hearts pounding because the memory of Parkland was still too fresh. Fear was no longer abstract. It became a constant presence, tied to the simple act of dropping a child off at school each day. Society entered a tense and painful dialogue. About guns. About mental health. About the responsibility of schools. Of families. Of law enforcement agencies. Debates erupted on television, in Congress, and in the streets. But beneath the heated arguments was a shared question. How do we make sure this never happens again? For students across the United States, Parkland changed the way they saw school. Safety drills became more serious. Backpacks were checked. Classroom doors were kept locked. Childhood, in many places, began to carry a sense of vigilance that should never have been necessary. In American culture, schools were once seen as symbols of hope and the future. After Parkland, that symbol was cast in shadow, not to erase belief, but to remind the nation that belief must be protected through action, not words alone. The aftershocks of Parkland are still felt. They live in families who say goodbye more cautiously each morning, in children who grow up faster than they should, and in a country forced to ask itself how many innocent lives the cost of delay can truly be. If history could be rewritten, perhaps the story of Parkland would have ended long before that Valentine's Day. Perhaps it would have taken only one adult willing to listen more closely, one system able to respond sooner, one timely act of support for a child who was quietly slipping deeper into instability. But history has no if. What happened cannot be undone. 17 people are gone, leaving empty chairs in classrooms, in families, and in the memory of a nation. That pain does not disappear with time. It simply changes shape, becoming hesitation, vigilance, and sometimes a quiet fear carried in the hearts of those who remain. Parkland was not just a shooting. It was a mirror reflecting the gaps society had grown used to ignoring. Warning signs that were minimized. Alerts that were not clear enough to prompt action, and children who grew up in silence until that silence finally shattered into violence. If history cannot be rewritten, then the only thing left is to learn how to remember. To remember the victims not only by name, but through responsibility. The responsibility to listen earlier, to care more deeply, and to act before it is too late. The story of Parkland ends here. But the question it leaves behind still echoes. How long will we wait before we truly listen? So that one day, no school will ever again become the starting point of a tragedy.